Hi everyone, my name is David and I would like to welcome each and every one of you to our June webinar regarding securing MySQL databases best practices. And during this session we will talk about a few very important things to do when working with MySQL databases that some of them are obvious and still people don't adopt it as part of their usage with this database. But I would like to start first of all with understanding what's going on in this market and what exactly and what the exact threats that you have to handle with on a daily basis when it comes to using a database. Without a doubt, the #1 global security challenge today is data theft. And as time passes, we see it more and more and happening actually on a daily basis. And the thing is that if, let's say, 10 years ago, the #1 threat that were on databases that your backup will be stolen, or maybe your DBA will steal the information if for some reason it decided to do so. Today, what the main problem is that you have no control. And more than that, most of the time, more than 90% of the time, once an organization have been breached and the information was stolen, you will not be able even to know that it actually happened. And as time passes, even though there are endless number of new security solutions and there are endless number of hardening documentation, most companies, specifically the smaller level of companies, don't adopt these kind of technologies. They don't even make the proper configuration to the small and size databases. Even though you spend a lot of time and a lot of money maybe securing and hardening the main databases in your infrastructure, many times it happens that the small and sideways databases are not being secured. And many times the same credentials that are used in the small databases that you haven't secured are being used also in your main databases. It's not getting any better because in front of you you can see a list of just the passing year, and these are just a few highlights. There's been hundreds of known breaches and thousands of unknown breaches. And just from the past few months, you can see that Evernote and Living Social and Jawbone and Twitter, and still it goes on. And just from the last 6 months, there's been more than 200 known massive breaches. And it gets to the point that it's not a question of if anymore. It's a question of when. When will you be breached? When the information that you own, when the information that you store of your customers, of your most important information, might be breached and might be leaked out. In GreenSQL, we have a specific solution for those, and we will talk about it at the end. But first of all, I would like to talk about the motivation for database security. So, who uses the database? Eventually, the database is the final frontier of your company. This is your company. Doesn't matter if you're talking about financial information, your HR data, your customer data, your private data, your IP. Most of the information that builds your company is stored inside the database. It can be the basic information from your entrance, a clock when people ticket their ticket when they start a day. It's also stored inside of a database, to the CRM application, to the ERP application, everything. And those databases have two types of connection. A user-based connection, mostly generated by the IT professionals, by the DBAs, by the IT administrators, and sometimes by the QA people. And there's second type, and the most used is automated connection, that you cannot actually control it. There is no validation, there is no ongoing control about what's happening with any type of automated connection, which means it's not someone who just generated a connection. The application that is running at the backside have generated this. And for this, we need to understand the threat and who are exactly the threat actors, which means that who exactly is interested in getting the data that is stored inside your databases. It can be hacktivists that just would like to publish it because something in their mind is telling them that your company or what your company represents should be spilled outside. It can be criminal elements, which means that someone is going to share this information for money. Someone is gonna do bad things with the type of information that it controls. In GreenSQL, almost once every few days, we receive a connection from a company that is screaming actually because someone have stole their information and is now threatening them that he will contact their customers if they will not pay money for him not to do so. The threat vector, where exactly from there is a threat on your database. And it's really important to say that the focus of any cyber attack, and you will hear about cyber threats and cyber attacks, is people. When I'm saying people, it's your own computers, it's your own smartphones, and it's your own devices that you take with you. And when it comes to systems, it's the servers, it's the switches, it's the network elements, and it's also the operating systems that runs everything. But it doesn't matter. If we'll try to look on the threat level, where from exactly a threat is being initiated and what type of a threat is it. When it comes to SQL injection attacks, it can be outside threat and also internal threats on local applications. We're talking about weak passwords and weak configuration. It can be vulnerabilities and password exposed. It can be even stolen tapes and stolen backups of your system. The database eventually, as I mentioned before, is the company, is the final frontier. And all the cyber attacks that you can imagine, eventually the main target is to get to your databases. And it doesn't matter which database you decided to use and with which application. When attackers reach to your databases, they can decide what they can do. But most of sophisticated attacks, not only that you will never know that they happened, they're actually ongoing. Every day, every week, sometimes once a month, people will still make sure that the information that you updated inside your databases will be retrieved as you go. And when it comes to threats and when it comes to the option to request money in order not to hurt your customer or not to hurt your facilities, they can even take you down. And when I'm saying take you down, it's not just the database, it's to take the entire facility. Information theft, without a doubt, is one of the biggest threats that currently any kind of organization have. Because hackers have become professionals. There's a business model that finances this entire process. And it doesn't matter if we're talking about SQL injections or if the option to make your employee workstation to be compromised and from this PC to start retrieving information from the database, information theft is a major issue. To your right, you can see a price list that we actually found online that you can buy for just a few dollars information about any American or Canadian citizen, but as time passes, we see that this is starting to be available worldwide. You can buy any type of private and personal information about any citizen worldwide today for just a few dollars. And just thinking about it, if you would like to attack or to know better a company, just get their management team from their website, buy all the sensitive information for a few $100s. You will know everything about each and every one of them. And this is all the intelligence that you need. Just 10 or 20 years ago, it probably would have cost you tens of thousands of dollars to get this information. But when this information have been leaked, you have the option to take control of this entire process. And this brings me to explain what's the attackability surface. Many times, when we think about databases, it doesn't matter again if it's a MySQL or MS SQL, we think only about the application and how come we need to harden it or to configure it more properly. But eventually, database is an application, and this application runs on an operating system. So we need to take control. It doesn't matter if the IT personnel is assisting or not. The operating system is part of the environment. And thinking about the attackability surface, any part of the surface that's called the entity of a database can lead to a full data breach and the information can be stolen. And if we're talking about a Windows operating system, once you've installed your MySQL over a Windows operating system, any part of those attack vectors can lead to a full data breach. All it takes just to steal a few files, just to stop your service, just to take your login auditing files, and they can get all the sensitive information that you store inside the database. And even though if you're using any Linux operating system, I'm a big SUSE fan, so I use SUSE quite often, but just in 2012, there's been more than 526 known vulnerabilities exposed. Not all of those vulnerabilities will provide a full option to create a full breach to the operating system, but I guess about 20% of those 526 vulnerabilities. All it takes for me to take over the operating system, and not only that I will steal your entire information from your database, as a DBA you will never know it. No logs will be available for you that someone have just copied your entire database. One of the most common attacks nowadays is what's called SQL injection attacks. And SQL injection attacks, it's a really interesting attack because we as a DBAs and as a database owners, we don't take into consideration that a third-party application, a web application, or even a closed source application vulnerabilities, or even miswritten, can lead for a full database breach. The thing is that once we have configured a web application, and it doesn't matter which type of a web application, we don't control the level of security of the web application. And just by wrong written or wrong coding of the web application, SQL injection can be extremely easily enforced, and the target is eventually the database. Just to show you about what I'm talking when I'm mentioning how easy it is to run SQL injection, when I would like to run, just for example, this tiny application that you can download online that's called Havij. Havij is a full advanced SQL injection tool. And this SQL injection just will require a simple link of a vulnerable web application. You don't have to know which database is running at the backend. You don't have to know which method to run and what even is exactly SQL injection. But it will provide you a full executed SQL injection attack that will provide you the option not only to retrieve information from the database, but also start attacking additional computers that are behind or next to the database server. It doesn't matter how secure is my network or my operating system, when we're talking about SQL injection attacks, it will not assist me to reduce the threat level. You can find online endless amount of information if you will look for SQL injection, and this can lead to a full data breach. How common is SQL injection attacks? This is the #1 threat on information in the top 10 OWASP, actually the 2013 report by OWASP. SQL injection is still #1 threat on information, which means your information is in constant threat just because someone have not written a web application. By the way, it doesn't matter if you write your own custom web application or if you purchase an application, most of the common vulnerabilities that are published on a daily basis, and by the way, you can see it published every day, like in link, in website like ExploitDB, and if you go to ExploitDB, they have a category that's called web applications. And you can see that almost every day, a few different closed source applications have a new SQL injection vulnerabilities and other type of a web-based application attacks that can lead to a full data breach. And as you can see, it's been updated almost on a daily basis, and you have to take control and to make sure that these threats will not affect the integrity and the information you stored inside your database. Most pen testers and pen testing company, which mean penetration testers, you can buy a pen testing service from companies, you can buy an ongoing service that once every few days or every few hours checks that your web application is not vulnerable, are saying that 65% of the clients turn out to be vulnerable to some sort of a SQL injection attack. Just that you think about the number, 65% of all clients of pen testers are vulnerable to some sort of a SQL injection attack. Many times when we talk with customer and tells them, do you see SQL injection as a threat? And some of them saying, well, my application is not vulnerable. I'm using an Microsoft Access as a database. I'm using a MySQL old version. It doesn't matter which type of application you use, and it almost doesn't matter which type of a database and which version you use. Almost all SQL databases and programming languages, and also all accessing through application development using any type of technology is vulnerable to SQL injection. There's an advanced method about running and executing SQL injection. You can read a lot about it online and you can see a lot of information available endlessly. But just to give you a grasp regarding the SQL injection methodology, the first part is finding an input validation that is not being sanitized by your web application. Sometimes it can be by a post form, sometimes it can be just by a non-sanitized link, and just to run it, to generate the error inside your web application, to generate the option to see that there's some sort of a negotiation that is not being sanitized. After you get this information, you start the attack. A SQL injection attack takes exactly a few seconds, and you can see if it's working or not. Once the attack is running, you can get a full, what's called OS interaction. You have the option to start interacting with the operating system of the database, and also to have the option to have a full OS interaction with multiple operating system writing and working right next to your database. Inside the database, you have the option to extract data, any type of data, and not only extract, but also to have the option to change information, to load information, to gather information, even to delete information. And once you have also an OS interaction, you have the option to actually start running commands inside the operating system. And if I'm running commands inside the operating system, I can download files, I can upload files, I can execute additional Trojan horse just in order to get control of your operating system. So this kind of methodology using SQL injection is being used thousands of times a day. It's not that hard. There are endless amount of scripts and small applications like the Havij that I showed you just a few minutes ago that provides you the option to do all of this in an automated way. The result, as I mentioned before, are eventually anything. You can do anything to that database, you can do anything to the information, you can start attacking additional computers that are not part of this network. And this brings me, before we go to the MySQL best practices, to explain that many times people see database as a one layer. But eventually the database are 3 different layers. And as a DBA, you have to start thinking on all those 3 layers, even though you are not the developer of this database. The first one is the connection layer, which means you have an application that binds a port number to your TCP/IP stack. And once it's being bound, there's a connection that has been generated from your application to the database server. This connection can be a regular plain text connection like most of us use. It can be an SSL connection, but there's still a connection that I have to make sure who's allowed to create this connection. For example, when a connection is being generated, it's starting much before the authentication and authorization part, which means there can be a full manipulation on the connection layer even before it reaches the authentication mechanism. Can I create multiple connections just in order to create a denial of service on your database? Can I have the option to make sure that I'm doing a performance degradation attack just to reduce the performance of your database because I found an open port available for a connection? Once a connection been established, only afterwards the database application protocol in MySQL and in any other database just start a negotiation, which means this is another layer that can cause different types of threats to the database. And only afterwards there is a full negotiation at the database application protocol layer. Only then the SQL database grammar is starting to work. Then you start running and entering the SQL commands to control your database, to get information, to update information, and all the regular usages that you use on a daily basis. So after understanding how exactly a database is built, and by the way, it doesn't matter which database, All of them are working on those three layers: the connection layer, the database application protocol layer, and only afterwards the SQL database grammar, the syntax that we run and execute commands to the database. So I would like to start with something that most of us don't take into consideration, but what are the most common and the top 5 most simple hacks to your database? The first one, without a doubt, is shell command history. Once we are writing a command and we type the username and a password inside this command line, because let's be honest, that's much easier, and I'm doing this on a daily basis to connect to the database, someone just types history in your console, in your shell account, and he can see the password. It's complicated, then write an encrypted script. It's too complicated, then find the way to make sure that it's not written inside the shell history. You will not believe, after breaching a system, just typing history and grep with MySQL, how many passwords we find. The second most common simple hack when it comes to MySQL is that a lot of hosting solutions use the same password structure, and you can find online that once you receive the password or a password have been generated automatically for you, it's a few characters and your customer name and sometimes also the IP address of the server. And those passwords can be extremely easily guessed. So make sure you change the password once you receive the database as a service, or if someone installed you and provided you a password. Even though it looks complex, another customer, the password looks exactly with the same complexity, and it's extremely easy to figure out what's your password just by browsing your website, just by seeing the connection, and just by guessing according to the hosting company what was the password of your MySQL. So change the password. Once we have the option to reset MySQL, once we are inside the operating system, and it doesn't matter if we're talking about Windows or Linux, we have the option to change passwords. And it's extremely easily executed, and we can see it on a daily basis that people change those passwords. So you have to restrict access to the entire process management. If you have to provide a shell access, make sure that they don't have the privileges to restart your process. You won't believe the number of MySQL installations that there is a user root without any passwords. Yes, it's much easier than remembering which password you use, but once you decided to take a database into production, or you started feeding your database with information, make sure you change your root password. Make sure you actually use a password to access the MySQL database. And the last most common way to attack MySQL, once any type of a web environment or any type of application that uses a database have been breached, people are just viewing what's called the connection string configuration file. You won't believe how many times people find a user root or an advanced user with a grant all privileges on your database that someone have just written down in your application connection strings. If you're going to write it down in a non-encrypted connection string configuration, maybe because your application doesn't support encrypted files, maybe because this is the only option you got, and this is the way you used to work, make sure that the user that you write down inside the configuration connection string have an extremely limited access and can do only simple things. You have the option also to use an encrypted connection string. You have the option to mask it. Maybe there's also another option to steal this information, but make sure that you're in control and you're making sure that no one sees this type of information. The installation process. Once you install MySQL, there's a very interesting MySQL secure installation procedure. It will make sure that you remove most of the unnecessary configuration, that you change the unnecessary privileges and unnecessary privilege accesses and the default names. Most people still don't use it, but adopt this as part of your day-by-day usage. MySQL secure installation. This will provide you the option that most of the configuration, not all of it, but most of it without a doubt, will be automatically configured once you run the MySQL secure installation. It will set root password, it will make sure that there is no anonymous access, it will disallow root login remotely, it will provide you all the necessary basic hardening configuration. This has been available for years, but still, many companies don't use it on a daily basis once they install MySQL. Once we connect to MySQL, it doesn't matter if I'm using a MySQL connection remotely over a shell, or I'm using SQL Yog or any type of application, 99.5% of the MySQL users do not use an SSL connection to the database. It's not that easy to set it up. And sometimes it's even annoying, but once you set it up, you can also find online a lot of scripts that explains this, a lot of scripts that assist you to make the proper configuration in order to enforce an SSL connection between your application to your database. In some countries, mostly Asian countries, we started to see a lot of regulation that demands that there will be only an SSL-based connection to the database. And this is something that should be adopted by any company. If you don't use SSL connection, anyone in the network or anyone in the grasp between your application or your client to the database server, with a simple TCP dump, he can see everything, because the communication between your applications and the database runs on a plain text connection. Anywhere that someone can sniff to your network, anywhere someone that can run any type of sniffer, or even more than that, even a basic listening mode on your network, can see the password running through the system. This is a simple TCP dump command, but think about it. If your database is stored in a hosting facility or in the cloud, and somewhere in the cloud, in the ISP, in the infrastructure in your ISP that leads you to a connection to your facilities, running a TCP dump somewhere, the entire connection is plain text, and it's extremely easy to steal password, any type of information. And once, by the way, the information is running in plain text, there is a much more complex attack that people can initiate, like injection and change by demand of any command that you run, because it's possible to interact inside the communication of this protocol. So user and privileges is one of the biggest problems when it comes to databases. Many times users don't take the time to configure the appropriate privileges per user. It's annoying. Sometimes it's really annoying because you have no way to know which type of access your application developer will really demand, and how exactly the access and the enforcement level part of the access that you will configure will actually cause problems or not to your database. And it's really important to understand that a grant all is the worst way to grant access to the database. Even though you do it for just 5 minutes, even though you created this user just for test, there's a saying that says the shortest time is the more used time, which means that eventually if I create a user, that I just grant all to him. I just gave him the entire privileges. And many times I will forget this user, I will not change the privileges. Just use what exactly you need to a specific source and to a specific database. Make sure that you're never giving grant all to any user. Besides yourself, maybe. Let's be honest, we want grant all. So logs and auditing. The option to log. Well, it's not even an option, it's a must those days. There are two mains of logs, error log and general log. It's not flexible enough, and sometimes it's annoying. It generates logs that it takes some time to analyze. You can actually run not such a sophisticated script level in order to upload this information to your database, so you can actually start digging inside this information to find proper and important part. There are new audit plugins that have been released in version 5.5 that sometimes it requires some sort of development, sometimes it requires some sort of indexing, but it's getting better. It handles the database events as needed, but even though you still don't have the proper configuration level in order to have a full auditing solution. But without a doubt, it's better than nothing. To our regret, there's some sort of a performance degradation to the entire server and also to the database. So take it into consideration if you should use a third-party application or use the internal one in order to get the audit information that you need. Many times, as I mentioned before, a part of the infrastructure that you are not responsible on can cause a full data breach, like a vulnerable web application. And to have a 5-second solution for that, many times people use a web application firewall or even buy a web application firewall as a service, like Encapsula, like Cloudflare, and other web application firewall as a service. The thing is that a web application might reduce I guess, even more than 95% of the threats that can come from a web application. But to our regret, our web application will make sure that any web vulnerability will not work properly. But when it comes to your SQL behavior, the only way that a web application firewall can stop SQL injection is using signatures. And those signatures goes without saying that are being updated, sometimes on a weekly basis, sometimes on a monthly basis, and the sophisticated types of attack can bypass it. Without a doubt, a web application firewall is a very important part of your security, don't get me wrong, but it doesn't have the knowledge, doesn't have the understanding how exactly to analyze the SQL commands and how exactly the SQL structure as part of your database is working, because the only thing that a web application sees is the HTTP traffic, the HTTP commands, and your application access. It doesn't have the option or the way to see which exactly SQL commands have been generated by this application that gets to your database. One of the important things about a database when it comes to application, please keep in mind, even though you have the greatest web application firewall, doesn't matter if it's by F5 or Imperva or Citrix, it doesn't matter. It only sits between the web application and the users. It doesn't enforce any security on your internal application and also on your internal DBA application and your outsourced communication. If you use an outsourced services to manage your database, you have to make sure that you control everything when it gets to the database. To sum up, what are more or less the needs in order to make sure that we are securing the database properly? We have to take control on security, which means the configuration that we talked about. It means patching the database and patching the operating system and making sure that the operating system is also secured and no one have access to the server of the MySQL. We have to think about auditing to see which administrative command have been executed, who exactly accessed sensitive columns inside our databases, and who exactly is allowed to do that. When it comes to performance, we have to make sure that using appropriate performance is not just in order to accelerate the user experience, it's also to reduce the denial of service threat. Many times when your database is not even accessible from the internet or from any application layer that the user have to connect with his application, like a web browser or a closed-party application. But the denial of service on a web application will cause many times a denial of service on your database. And once your database is bypassing the 500 or even 5,000 connections, most of the time your database application will collapse, will crash. And handling this can cause a major problem. Masking your sensitive information, and this goes without saying, brings me also to database in the cloud. There are new solutions that are growing rapidly, like Microsoft SQL Azure, like Amazon RDS MySQL or Amazon RDS MS SQL, that are providing a database in the cloud. So you are hassle-free when it comes to the operational part of the database. They will make sure that it's optimized, they will make sure that it's updated, they will make sure that no one have access to it without a doubt. But you are the only master of your information. You have to make sure who can exactly access what type of security policy, and many times the management interfaces and the security privilege management as part of the database as a service are not efficient enough, don't have the complex and required configuration that is needed. This brings me back to GreenSQL, what exactly we are doing. We are a full reverse proxy solution, which means we sit between any application and the database. More than that, once you install GreenSQL, no one should have direct access to the database server. Most of our customers actually place the database server behind a firewall. And the GreenSQL, as I mentioned before, the 3 different layers that talks with the database, GreenSQL sits between all your application. It doesn't matter if it's a management application, your SQL YAG, even if it's your connection, if it's your web server, all your application connects only to the GreenSQL port or IP address once you install it. But only afterwards, once the communication have been approved, once the command have been approved, once the command doesn't make any threat on your database, only afterwards the communication will be forwarded to your database. One of the advanced features that a reverse proxy methodology provides us is to provide you a fallback database, which means if your main database server will not be available for some reason, maybe your operating system have collapsed, maybe something crashed as part of your database server, GreenSQL will automatically go to what's called a fallback database. It will redirect the connection to a secondary database. So GreenSQL also assists you as a company or you as a solution to maintain business continuity. When it comes to database security, what GreenSQL really provides, we provide you an extremely easy to use interface that provides you the option to enforce a full database firewall, a full separation of duties, which means that you can decide what and which type of information and which type of commands a specific source. A source can be an IP address, a source can be a database user, and a source can be an application name, will be able to run on a dedicated database instance, a group of database servers, or even on a specific table inside your database. Once anything have been generated, any type of command, log will be generated. And the log provides you the option to see which exact commands have been executed, which type, who was the user from which IP address, what was the full pattern of the command, what was the instance affected, and also which user have been used in order to perform this type of access to the database. Database activity monitoring, what also called database auditing. You have 2 types of auditing. The first one is administrative level auditing, to be alerted over email or over syslog once any type of administrative commands have been executed. The second part that you can see in your screen capture is the option to see any type of access to a sensitive column. Yes, up to a column level resolution, which means just configure your most sensitive 20 columns, and anytime someone will try to view information, modify, or delete information in those locations, you will be alerted, including all the information. The tiny checkbox, what we call advanced activity monitoring, will provide you the option to see a clear before and after of any change inside the database. Just to give you an example, once someone ran an update command, and you can see the full query below, a regular update command have been generated by some sort of an application to change a specific value of an email address. Not only that you will see who did what when you press the session details, but you will also have the option to see what was the previous data in this specific field as part of this column. So advanced activity monitoring, we provide an audit trail to your information. It's important to say that the performance are not being affected by GreenSQL to your database, which means your database will still maintain, not only maintain, will actually increase the performance of the database using GreenSQL. The last and not least feature that GreenSQL provides is what's called dynamic data masking, which means we are making sure that sensitive information will never be available according to the policy that you created. You can hide sensitive information. There are more than 12 different masking behavior that we can mask the sensitive information according up to a column level. You just configure your most sensitive columns and you decide from which IP addresses you will see this information and from which you'll not. And you can extremely easily enforce a policy. The advantage of using a dynamic data masking is that the sensitive information never leaves the database. Even GreenSQL as a proxy doesn't seize this information. And it works in a way that once we detect a query as running to retrieve information from a sensitive location, we inject the transformation inside this query, so the entity that does the masking is your own database. And because of the integration that we have, also performance features like database caching is part of GreenSQL and protocol optimization is part of GreenSQL, this only happens once. So even though you have configured dynamic data masking, your performance will be accelerated because this information will be available from the cached information inside GreenSQL. We're working very hard to add additional features. Like I just mentioned, there's a synergy today between the masking and caching. But as time passes, we add additional features in order to increase the synergy between the different components. So the security mechanism will have the option and the integration to increase the security by making sure if there is some sort of a specific threat that have been generated by a query, it will only be provided from the caching. And once there is a threat that is being generated because too much information have been retrieved from the database, there will be a change according to the configuration that you've configured and also according to the threat level. So the synergy of multiple security solutions running in one environment and everything was written by the same vendor, the integration provides an extremely high level of security for you as a database owner. To sum things up, how GreenSQL actually sees that, GreenSQL is the only solution in the market that not only it's extremely easy to use, it doesn't require an overtime for you as a DBA or as a security professional. We are providing the four main features of database security, database auditing, dynamic data masking, and database acceleration in order to make sure that your database works the best, is the most secure, and because we work as a reverse proxy approach, we are providing a full security to your entire database entity, which includes any application you run on the same server and also the GreenSQL as a solution. I would like to thank you for joining our June webinar. Very shortly we will publish another webinar update, but please feel free to contact us at any time with any question that you might have, and you're welcome to visit our website, which is without a doubt your reference for database security. Not only that we publish manuals and also hardening manuals in our website to MySQL and other database servers that you can find online, we're also available to any questions that you might have. So please feel free to contact us anytime, and we will be more than happy to provide you a private session to database security, a private session for installation and configuration of GreenSQL, and with any question that you might have. I would like to thank you again for your time today, and please feel free to join us anytime in the future. Have a great day, and we hope to see you again in our next webinar.